I'm Jessica Jordan. You're listening to American Edition on the Voice of Russia. Well, in light of the 11th anniversary of the September 11, 2001 terror attacks, we're taking a look back at the U.S. economy and how it was impacted by that event. My guests are Frederick Joutz. He's a professor of economics and co-director of the research program on forecasting at George Washington University. Also on the line, Lawrence White. He's professor of economics in the Leonard N. Stern School of Business at NYU. Welcome to you both, and thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
The University of Southern California's Terrorism Research Center put out a study back in 2010 that measured the economic impact of the September 11th attacks, saying the attacks cost the economy $35 billion to $109 billion, which was much lower numbers than original estimates, which had ranged as high as $500 billion. Is this study still considered accurate in its measurement of how much 9/11 impacted the economy? I'll have you both weigh in on this. Frederick Joutz?
I think it really depends upon the perception of how one's measuring this in terms of the horizon. Are they talking about the short run or the long run? And my understanding of that CREATE report was that was the initial impacts on the U.S. economy in the short run.
But there are still long-term effects, right?
That's correct. That probably are far larger than that.
Lawrence White, what would those long-term effects be, and are we still seeing those take place? And could you guesstimate on how much you would guess that the 9/11 attacks had impacted the economy in terms of a monetary number?
Well, I mean, the way I think about it is the attacks really, in a sense, increased the amount of friction in the U.S. economy. We use more of our resources for things related to security that could otherwise be used for goods and service, sweaters or cars or computers or computer software, computer games, instead of using our resources in a more productive way. If we didn't have all these terrorism fears, we've had to devote the resources instead to more security guards, more time that you have to spend at the airport going through the Homeland Security checkpoints, as well as the employment of those people. Those are all, they may show up as a positive component of GDP because it's employing people and you've got government and the private sector spending money on it, but it's not a productive use of our resources as compared with the way they could have been used if the terrorism weren't there. I see that as one major cost. The other is just it heightened tensions vis-a-vis Arab, Middle Eastern countries more generally, and that always means higher prices for petroleum. Since we've been a net importing country of petroleum, that means a bigger net drain on the U.S. economy in that direction as well. Those are both, I think, substantial costs.
To that first point, I believe we saw more resources, to the first point of security, more resources put towards homeland security, national defense, and even in the private sector.
I mean, nowadays, almost impossible to go into an office building in Washington, D.C., or in New York City or any major city. You have to stop at a guard's desk or a security desk. And that's been true for government now for 20 or 30 years, but the private sector now is employing more security than used to be the case. And that's just extra cost. In a terrorist-oriented world, presumably it brings benefit, but if we didn't have the terrorism, we wouldn't need the cost in the first place, and we could devote the resources to something else that would be more productive.
Frederick Joutz, did you want to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with Larry on this, in that the major impact has been on the change in composition of economic activity towards resources devoted to security, preventing and responding to terrorism, whether it's domestic or international. So the private firms and the government have reallocated workers and expenditures in that way. But the important thing to remember in this is that, or several things, are that one person's spending is another person's income. So since 9/11, the U.S. has spent about $600 billion on this entity we call Homeland Security, and defense spending has gone up by about $1.7 trillion from what it otherwise would have been had we been on the path we were in 2000. So those are some pretty large numbers. Again, that some of that spending goes into the pockets of American consumers. It's just not in the things that we're most interested in. Another thing that's really important to think about this is, the objective here was, Osama bin Laden wanted to try to drive us to bankruptcy, and clearly he failed, okay? And they wanted to sabotage the economy. Well, two things for the long term are really important to remember. One is that the market system worked in reallocating resources in the short run, and it certainly has in the long run. So they haven't changed our system. And then the second case, thinking about long-term productivity, and it doesn't really look that 9/11 had any effect whatsoever on productivity, which is surprising, I think, given these reallocation of resources. Of course, Larry and I both know that the productivity numbers have a lot of error in them, but it doesn't appear like the long-term trends of productivity have changed, at least due to 9/11.
And we also saw resources diverted to the New York City Police Department's counterterrorism initiatives, where they are trying to fight terrorism. Their Police Commissioner Raymond Kelly created this counterterrorism bureau and reformed the intelligence division. That was obviously more resources there allocated to security, at least on that local level.
Right. I mean, these are all, somewhat subtle, and as was just pointed out, it contributes to GDP, and so since it's a legitimate activity, people are legitimately employed, the resources are being legitimately used. It will show up as a positive productivity feature. But if you think of an alternative world where there wasn't that terrorism fear lurking out there, we could have used those resources in alternative ways. I mean, it's in a sense like, if the environment has changed, if your neighborhood becomes more crime-ridden, you're going to have to spend more money putting bars on your window, installing an alarm system, doing other things that, yes, they do make you more safe, but gee, if the crime hadn't risen in your neighborhood, you wouldn't have had to spend your money, your resources on those things, and you could have spent them on other things that would have made you happy.
Frederick Joutz, I think, can we also say that one of the indirect effects then from the attacks were the wars, the war in Afghanistan, as well as we talked about Homeland Security spending, but can you also not point to the war in Afghanistan as a major source of spending there?
Well, yeah, that's what I was mentioning before with the direct outcome from 9/11 was involvement even today in Afghanistan, and there the defense budgets that we can allocate to Afghanistan and subsequently Iraq are about $1.7 trillion higher than they otherwise would have been. That's how much we've spent so far. Unfortunately, we have a lot of Americans who've come back with disabilities, and if we look at the impact of veterans and expenditures on that, there we may be talking another $700 to $800 billion of veterans care. And again, to Larry's point, is that, we changed how we would spend absent 9/11. And in this case, all of this government spending has not been associated with any taxes related to funding the war or anything like that. And I think if we as citizens had the choice to think about, are we going to pay for this today, or are we going to make our children and grandchildren pay for it, it might have been a different decision here.
I agree with that as well.
Will we continue to see, effects from this in terms of tourism? Because right after the attacks, tourism in New York City plummeted which caused unemployment and even more problems there. Are we still seeing the effects of that?
Well, all right. New York has certainly come back in terms of its overall attractiveness to tourists. Tourism has clearly come back but again, one of these more subtle consequences, the U.S. tightened its whole entry into the U.S. process. It's harder for people to come visit. Visas are tighter. It's a harder thing. Tourists still come, but it's a harder thing for them to do. It's just another one of these unfortunate fallout aspects of what happened on September.
At one point we haven't touched upon yet either is the airlines, how they were impacted because they were having some financial troubles before the attacks ever took place. What impact did the attacks have on the airlines, and are we still seeing those effects continuing to take place today? Frederick Joutz?
I can think of 2 points here. One is that airline travel certainly did decline in the aftermath, and I think it took about 2 years or so for passenger travel to reach the level it was before 9/11. However, since then, the trend in passenger travel has gone back to what it was. In fact, maybe it's a little higher. But then there's also this point about fuel costs. And are they higher now than they otherwise would have been? And probably the argument is yes, they are higher because of the instability created 9/11 and Al-Qaeda and its sort of affiliates, however you want to call it. So it has, raised those costs to airlines. But internationally, there's large increases in passenger traffic. I think the economics of the airline industry, I think Larry's probably better at this than I am, that they always seem to stink. They seem to not be very good in their economics.
I think that's generally true. I would echo what Frederick just said, that there was a clear immediate impact. People were more reluctant to fly. I can remember in October of 2001 flying from New York to Pittsburgh, and this was a Friday afternoon. I was flying out of LaGuardia Airport. I happened to be flying on U.S. Airways, and Friday afternoon, normally a peak time for the, like 3 or 4 in the afternoon, a peak time for the airlines, and the U.S. Airways terminal at LaGuardia was a ghost town. You could have lay down in the middle of the gate area, gone to sleep, and nobody would have disturbed you. It was a very saddening, somber feeling. They have revived since then, and for better or for worse, they're basically back on. People fly again. I don't think there's a lot of conscious thought of, are bad things going to happen? I think people put a lot of confidence, and I think rightly so, in the security system. It's costly, but it does work. But the airlines do bear higher costs. Partly they are, I think, bearing some of the costs for the security system. There are those higher fuel costs, and the aircraft is a little more costly. The pilot area is now blocked off and can't be entered very. There are some small costs, but it was the major. The major effects were in the immediate year or two after.
We've been taking a look at the impact on the U.S. economy from the September 11th attacks. I've been speaking with Frederick Joutz. He's a professor of economics, and he's co-director of the research program on forecasting at George Washington University, as well as Lawrence White. He's professor of economics in the Leonard N. Stern School of Business at NYU. Thanks so much to both of you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you.